today from Paul's letter to the Ephesians in chapter 2 in verse 8, just as a little framework or foundation for what I want to say. This is a fundamental truth, I feel, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. And verses 8, 9, and 10 of Ephesians chapter 2 are one of those little passages that are, as I said, foundational or fundamental, and we always have to keep them in mind when we read everything else. In other words, fundamental truth, foundational truth, is always solid and consistent, and when we read other passages, we have to interpret them in the light of these very simple foundational truths. In other words, when we turn the page, Paul's not going to say the opposite thing. So we have to frame our interpretation of everything else he says in the light of these very straightforward and simple truths, like this one. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, Paul says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God." Then he says in verse 9, "Not of works, lest any man should boast." Verse 10 says, "For we," meaning we Christians, we who believe in Jesus and trust in Him, we Christians, we are His workmanship, created. That's His work, by the way. You notice He is emphasizing God's work. Created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. By framing it this way, Paul even says that the good things that we do are things that are the result of God's work. That's what he's saying. And that He's already figured it out ahead of time. So he's putting all the emphasis on God. And the only thing he says about us in these three verses is faith, that we believe. That's our responsibility. And that's the whole of our responsibility where God is concerned, to trust or to believe or to place our faith in Jesus. Notice again in verse 8, one more time before I move on. We want to keep this in mind. He says, "By grace you're saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God." He's saying that our relationship with God, our what he calls salvation or saved, is a gift. A gift is something that's given freely, with no strings attached, and cannot be rescinded. It's given freely with no strings attached. That's what a gift is. That's what our salvation is. Something God offers to everyone and gives freely and never takes it back. It's a gift. Now, with that in mind, turn a page to the next letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. This is the very next epistle in the New Testament. And notice something he says. Now, I read all that to you so you can keep that in mind when we read this. Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. And Torrance is going to find that for you. Paul writes to the Philippians, "Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence," that is to say, he's not with them. In fact, when he writes this letter to the Philippians, he's in jail. He's in a Roman prison, in the dungeon, basically. And he's writing to them because the truth of it is, if you read this whole letter, they sent him some kind of gift. They sent him something to help him in prison. And he says, nobody else did that. Everybody else forgot about me. But you remembered me. So he's thanking them. Now he says, "As you have obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence." Listen to this. "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Next verse says in verse 13, "For it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do of His good pleasure." Now back in verse 12, when he says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling," casual readers of the New Testament, and I should add those who deliberately want to portray it in a light that it's not meant to be portrayed, will say, well, see there, you've got to work for your salvation. But that's not what he says. Just remember what we read a moment ago. The same person who wrote this also wrote, "Salvation is the gift of God, not of works." Isn't that what he said? Not of works. It means you don't work for it. We do not work and cannot work to acquire our salvation. But what he's saying here is, this is actually something very positive. What he's saying here is, the salvation that you have received freely as a gift, now you get to work out all the details. That's what he means. That's my paraphrase. Work out the details of your salvation. Now that's actually a very positive thing. But I'll come back to that in a moment. But first I have to deal with this expression so that you don't misunderstand this. With fear and trembling, King James translation says. Now when we read that, it makes an impression on us that it did not make 400 years ago when this translation was made. In the world of the King James translation in 1611, think about that, 400 years ago, 100 years ago is a long time ago. 400 years ago, language, in some ways, the usage has changed. Fear and trembling in that world meant respect. It meant reverence and respect. It's like fancy language. When you would go in before the king, like at that time King James, if you were called into the court, you would come in very respectful and very reverently, and they would say, you approach the king with fear and trembling. That doesn't mean you're afraid, the way we think of it, like you're afraid of a tornado or afraid of a rattlesnake or something. That just means you show appropriate respect. A more modern translation, I think, gets closer to what this is saying. The Phillips translation writes, work out the details of your own salvation with awe and responsibility. And I think that is more closer to what Paul is getting at here. Because the very next verse he says, for it is God that worketh in you. That means in your life. God Himself, the creator of the universe, is at work within the context of your own life. So he's saying, think about that with a kind of awe and respect. It is an awesome thought, if you consider it, and that's what he's getting at. Think about it responsibly and reverently with the awesome kind of respect that it deserves, because God has come into your life to work out the details of your salvation in your life. Now, in verse 12, when he says work out your own salvation, he means, first of all, that your salvation, which you received as a gift, it's not a matter of conformity. It's not one size fits all. It's tailored specifically by God to you. Remember what we read in Ephesians? We are His workmanship. He doesn't have an assembly line where He's got a big cookie cutter and He stamps out everybody exactly alike. We're all unique individuals. We've all got different details of our lives. We're all different from one another. And when he's saying here, work out the details of your own salvation, he's saying, everything is going to be different from one person to the next, and you've got specific situations that everybody else doesn't have, but God's at work in your life in the context of where you're at. Here's the beautiful thing about it. God receives us and accepts us just like we are, just who we are, and He knows who we are. He knows everything about us. And we're told all over the place in the New Testament that God, knowing everything about us, loves us. He's intimately acquainted with us. He wants to help us. God is at work in our lives. And here's the thing. Working within the context of who you are and what you have and what you need. Now, I wanted to show you a few passages that kind of highlight this. This is in John's Gospel, chapter 6, and I'm going to start reading with verse 1. And I want you to notice something about this. John's Gospel, chapter 6, I'm going to start with verse 1. This is a very familiar story, by the way. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed Him because they saw His miracles which He did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain there, and there He sat with His disciples. And the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was nigh, or near. When Jesus then lifted up His eyes, He saw a great company come unto Him, and saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread, that these may eat? In other words, there's this big crowd, so He says to one of the disciples, Where are we going to get some bread, some food to feed them? Verse 6, This He said to prove Him. In other words, He's just saying it for Philip's benefit, because he knew what he would do. John's just adding that. He's wanting to get Philip to start thinking. I think this is really a profound thought. He's wanting to get his disciples, his followers, his close, intimate associates, to begin to think a little differently. He wants them to consider something they might not have considered before. So he said it for Philip's benefit. So Philip said, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. Now, we don't have to get into analyzing what's a pennyworth and how much money that is. All he's saying is, we haven't got what it takes to get this job done. You say, who's going to feed them? Well, we don't have that kind of money. And even if we had whatever this 200 pennyworth is, that still wouldn't be sufficient. It's not, in other words, what we have is not sufficient to meet this challenge that we're facing. That's an important point. Let me just linger on it for a moment. Philip, looking at his life, looking at his situation, looking at where they're standing right now, he says, where we're at right now, it's what we have right now. It's not sufficient to deal with what we have to deal with here. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, verse 8, said to him, verse 9, there's a lad here which has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. Now, I don't know what that kid's doing with those 5 barley loaves. Maybe he brought them there to sell them. Maybe he is, got some friends he's coming to feed them. We don't know why he had all that food. But that's still not enough. 5 loaves of bread, 5 barley loaves, and 2 small fishes. So there's this huge crowd, and they got a little boy who's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 little fish. And he says, well, here's what we have. It's not enough. Now, verse 10, Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down. In number, about 5,000. So this is how you know they didn't have enough. 5,000 people, 5 loaves of bread, 2 little fish. Jesus took the loaves, he took what they had. He took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, likewise the fishes as much as they would. And when they were filled, he said to the disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which remained, over and above unto them that had eaten. So this was a marvelous miracle. But let's just analyze what happened. What they had on their own was not sufficient to deal with their situation. But here's the thing, they were not alone. They were not on their own. Jesus was with them. Jesus took what they had. He worked within the context of what they had, and he blessed it, and he made it sufficient. Now here's the application for us. You might look at your life in certain situations and say, I don't know how to deal with this. I'm not sufficient to deal with things I've got to deal with. That's okay, because Jesus is sufficient. But here's the way he works. We can learn how he works. He works within the context of our lives, and he blesses who we are and what we have and makes it work. He takes what you have. In other words, he didn't tell them to go away and get something they didn't have. He works with what you've got. Now, here's the way we think. We think, well, I'm not a good person. I'm not good enough for this. I'm not good enough for that. No, he doesn't tell you to go away and improve things. He says, I will work with you where you're at right now and bless you and your life and what you have and who you are right now, and I'll make it work. He works within the context of who we are and what we have. He works out the details of our salvation with us right where we are. I think that's a great story. By the way, this is one of the only stories that all 4 Gospels contain. Most of the stories are they're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're not in John, or some are in John, but they're not Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This little story here is in all 4 Gospels. So that tells me that this is an important one, that we should get the point here. But let's look at another one. This is in same Gospel, John's Gospel. Turn back to chapter 2. This is another good story like this. John's Gospel, chapter 2. Is everybody comfortable? It's getting kind of hot up here. Is everybody okay?
I think it is too.
Yeah? Why don't you turn it whichever way it needs to turn? I don't know. No, not just you.
I think I turned it a notch too far.
No, it's okay. No, April told me she was getting cold, and And I'll be honest with you, when I came in here this morning,
Yeah,
I
I
can't-
came back on 70.
I came in this morning and
73.
yeah, I know, you can't ever tell. I opened up the door and said, oh, this will be the one day we don't have to turn on the air conditioner or the heater. No, we got to always have something, I guess. Okay, John's Gospel, chapter 2. We'll be okay. We'll make it. I'll get some I'll get some fans out here if I need to. John's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 1. And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, that means they ran out of wine for this marriage, this wedding. The mother of Jesus said unto him, they have no wine. Verse 4, Jesus saith unto her, woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. That's just a fancy way of saying, what are you telling me for? You know, what am I? You know, am I the caterer? You know? Well, so she brought this situation. There was an insufficiency. There was a lack. There was a problem. There was something they couldn't deal with because they didn't have what was necessary. Verse 5. His mother saith unto the servants, whatever he saith unto you, do it. She knew enough about him by now to know whatever he says, just do what he says, don't ask any questions. And, okay, verse 6. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Now notice, Jesus didn't send them out to Walmart to buy 6 water pots. They were there already. In other words, they were already on hand. This is what they had, 6 water pots. This is what was there. You know, if it had said 6 styrofoam cups, this would have been the same thing. It doesn't matter. There's nothing special about the water pots. It's just what was there, what they had. They didn't have the wine that they needed, but here's what they had, 6 water pots of stone. Verse 7, Jesus saith unto them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, draw out now, and bear to the governor of the feast. And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine for last, or till now. And so, you know, this kind of changes our impression of Jesus. He made wine for them. He turned water into wine. Well, that was the lack. That was the need. That was the problem. But here's the point I want to make today. He used what they had. He blessed what they had, just like with the 5 barley loaves and the 2 little fish. He didn't ask them to change anything. He didn't ask them to go and, or even get mad at them and say, why didn't you plan ahead? Why did you do to, why didn't you think about this? He didn't chastise them at all. He didn't correct them. He didn't find any fault with them. He just, in the context of what they had at that moment, he just blessed what they had and made it work. He worked out the details, you might say. See, the application is in our lives, what do we have? Who are we? He takes what we have and who we are, and he blesses it, and he makes it sufficient to meet whatever challenge that we have to face. I think that's a beautiful picture there. Here's another one. This is in the Old Testament. Turn back to Exodus, Torrin. This is Exodus chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. And this is the story of Moses. He was sent by God to deliver the children of Israel out of bondage. If you've ever seen that movie, they show at Easter time, the 10 Commandments. You might know this story already. You might have even read it in the Bible. It's a Bible story, not just a Charlton Heston movie. God sent Moses, and he said, Moses, I want you to go, and the children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, they're in bondage in Egypt. They're held as servants. And Moses, I want you to go and set them free. And Moses, of course, just like any of us would say, well, who am I to be doing something like that? See, he recognized his own insufficiency. If you've ever read the story, you know that he had quite a challenge. God had to really motivate him. What was hard for Moses to understand, and God had to get across with him, is Moses wasn't going to go alone. God went with him, you see. Here's the thing that's a challenge for us to understand. We're not walking through life alone. Jesus is walking with us. And if we'll allow him to, if we'll expect and believe that he will bless us with what we have and make it sufficient to deal with whatever we have to deal with. Okay, so Moses is talking to God here, and God's sending him to Egypt to go and set the children of Israel free. Moses answered and said, "But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. For they will say, the Lord hath not appeared to thee." In other words, they're going to say, well, who do you think you are? How do we know if this is the case? And verse 2. Now, this is really interesting. "And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thine hand? And he said, A rod." Now, he didn't go tell Moses, "I want you to run to the store and buy a rod. That's what I need you to get." No. He said, "What do you got right now? What do you have in your hand?" This is important. What do you have in your hand? In other words, what's the situation where you're at right now? He didn't tell him to improve it, didn't tell him to get something he didn't have. "What do you got right now, Moses?" "Oh, well, I got my rod." He's a shepherd, his shepherd's rod. "A rod," verse 3. "And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it." Well, I would too, I understand. "And the Lord said to him, Put forth thine hand and take it by the tail." Well, generally you wouldn't do that with snake. I think I'd have to think twice before I grab a snake by the tail. But when God tells you to do it, well, you kind of got to do that. And he caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. Well, that's a pretty impressive thing. Pretty good deal there. But here's the point I wanted to make. This is the only point I wanted to get at. Just like at the wedding when they ran out of wine, Jesus said, "What do you got here?" 6 water pots. Okay, fill them up with water, take them to the feast, and problem solved. "What do you have on hand?" He said to Moses, "What do you got in your hand?" "Well, I got a rod." Well, that's going to be what God used, what he had. You see, in your life, where are you right now? What do you have right now? He's going to bless, he can bless where we are, what we have right now, and make it sufficient to meet whatever challenge we need. Now, here is how Paul puts it. Back to Philippians, where we started. Philippians chapter 4 this time. And I'm going to turn over here and look at this. Philippians chapter 4. And, I'm on the wrong page. I think I want to start reading with, let's see. Verse 10. Let's just get the background here. I'm going to start with verse 10. Paul says, writing to the Philippians, remember what I said. Paul is here at this point in prison. And the Philippians are the only one of the churches that Paul founded who remembered him in prison and who helped him. Part of the reason was Paul was in prison in Rome, imprisoned by Nero. And Nero was a crazy, wild, unpredictable ruler. And he liked to put Christians to death, so we're told. And so I can just imagine that most of the Christians thought, Paul's in prison, well, good luck to you, Paul, but we're not going to come anywhere near there, because what happened to you might happen to us too. But the Philippians were not afraid, evidently, and they sent Paul a gift in the prison. So he's thanking them for this, verse 10. "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, and now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity." In other words, I know that you would have if you could have. You had me in mind, but you didn't have an opportunity. Verse 11. "But now I speak, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." Now, when we read the word content, we just mean, we think it means, well, just whatever, que sera, however it is, it is. That's really not what he's saying there. A better translation would be independent of circumstances. That's what he's saying. I have learned in whatever situation I am not to be ruled by the circumstances I'm in. That'd be a better way to understand that. Because what he says next sheds some light on it. Verse 12. "I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. In other words, I'm independent of the circumstances. If I've got plenty, I'm okay with that. If there's not enough, I'm okay with that. Well, how can you say that, Paul? How can you be independent of the circumstances you're in? Well, look at the next verse and he explains it, verse 13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. I can, what things? Well, whatever things I'm called upon to do, whatever things I'm facing. You know, in the previous verse, he said, if I have plenty, I'm okay with that. If I don't seem to have enough, that doesn't bother me either. Here's why. Let me paraphrase it. I can deal with everything. Another translation says, this is the Phillips translation, says, I am ready for anything through the strength of the one who lives within me. Now remember what we read earlier when Paul wrote, right here in this very book of Philippians, he says, work out, and I'm going to add my interpretation, work out the details of your own salvation, for it is God that worketh in you. It's God at work in you to will and to do of His good pleasure. He's saying, you know, whatever situation you face, whatever problems, whatever issue, whatever you have to deal with, just keep this in mind. God is with you. He's at work within you. And here he says, use me as an example. He says, I can deal with anything I face. I can do all things. I can handle anything that comes along because I'm not alone. Christ is strengthening me. And it's not just Paul. You know, Jesus didn't just die for Paul. He's using himself as an example. He loves you the same way. And He's at work in your life in the same exact way. And you can say the same thing about your life. I'm ready for anything. I can deal with anything that comes my way. I can handle any situation that crops up, not because I'm special, not because I'm sufficient, because I'm not sufficient. I don't know what to do. You know, I'm not capable. But there's somebody who is capable, who's with me, who's helping me, who's strengthening me. Same for all of you. We can deal with whatever we face. We each have details of our lives that are unique to us, but He works with us, who we are, what we have, where we are, just as we are, and He works out the details. He's at work, making His sufficiency be our sufficiency. Okay, that was a little short, but I think that's all I got today. I think that makes the point. Let's all stand up today.